Welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our Japanese Politics 101 room. Every Sunday, Timothy Langley, who runs a company in Tokyo that focuses exclusively on Japanese politics, government, and public affairs, and host Maya Matsuoka, bring to you the latest developments in Japanese politics. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions, so if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the conversations on Japanese politics, business insights, and Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. This week, our main topic will be the issues that were discussed during the election campaign in contrast to those that weren't, and how both might be addressed after the election.
Thank you, Maya, and thanks everybody for signing in. Today is election day. It's something that we've been looking forward to. The elections run for 10 days in Japan. This is a culmination. Campaigning stopped yesterday at sunset, and so now everybody is sitting on their hands, waiting to see what happens. The polls opened at 6 minutes ago, and so people are going in to vote. You might remember where we were just last week. Our briefing last week talked about, some of the potential outcomes. We talked about the various political parties and what their numbers were and what their numbers are going to look like possibly after the election. And we predicted a couple of outcomes of what is possible to happen. The LDP wins, they win really big, they don't even need Komeito. The other scenario was that Komeito and LDP, they remain in a coalition, they remain over 50% combined. The third scenario was that LDP and Komeito don't really have much of a majority, so they bring in other parties that are somewhat similar to them. For example, Ishin is very similar and kind of a floater. I think they would accept a invitation to be in a coalition with the LDP. And then the fourth scenario, the most unlikely one that we discussed, was that the LDP just does so poorly and it loses to a coalition of perhaps the Constitutional Democratic Party and the Communists. That's just very far-fetched, but those are the two largest opposition parties. Any way you look at it is hard to reach that conclusion. But anyway, we discussed that last week. And what I'd like to talk about today is, now that the election is over, what are the issues that really, over the campaign period, resonated and people talked about or people argued about? Different parties held different positions. So there are certain issues that came up. And the reason why I want to talk about them is because I want to contrast that to the issues that didn't come up. And the issues that didn't come up doesn't mean that they're not important or that they're not going to be handled. And the fact that the issues that did come up doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to be addressed after the election. But to just talk about what that dynamic is helps us predict what's going to happen after the elections under the most likely scenario of the LDP and the Komeito staying in some sort of a coalition partnership. And before I get into those issues that are talked about, contrasted with those that are not talked about, I want to talk about what it means for the LDP and Komeito to be in a position of power, in a majority position, as contrasted with a two-thirds supermajority position. So the majority position means, realistically, that when the diet comes back and it is opened again, number one, we have to have the cabinet reinstalled. Members of the cabinet, some of them were up for election. In fact, most of them, I think, were from the lower house. And there are various committee appointments that are assigned and memberships to various committees. So once we come back, if the party in power maintains a majority vote, when they're voting for committee chairs, the LDP has the sway there. So that means that if in in a coalition, the LDP and the Komeito hold a powerful sway, then all of the committees, the LDP is in the bird seat for the chairmanship. So that means bills can be accepted quickly. Other bills that are proposed or controversies that are interjected, they can be killed easily by the chair exercising his dominant control. So the reason why the LDP and Komeito coalition is so important to exceed that maximum, that at least 50%, is really for these committee appointments. So when you don't have that, the Diet proceedings become long and contentious, and things just don't happen. That happens with many administrations. The flip side of this is that depending on the LDP having a majority, which is about 233 seats, if they maintain that, that's one half of the seats that are up. They could use the Komeito. They need to rely on Komeito, but if they fall below that, then they really need Komeito. So that means that the number of committee seats and perhaps even another cabinet seat needs to go to Komeito. When that happens, they're typically, for Komeito, they're typically one cabinet position that the Komeito frequently gets, because they get ingrained in that. They get in-depth knowledge, they get legacy knowledge, and likewise with several committees. If the LDP is required under Diet proceedings to relinquish more committee seats to Komeito, there are more seats that they get, and they typically tend to become legacy seats, until the next election. So that's the real core issue of why the 50% and greater is so important. So it's a bit of a diversion, and I apologize, but it is important to know that it's not just the ministerial portfolios or who's prime minister. It's what happens in the machinery of the Diet. So the election is today. Everything will be decided tonight. Some races will be decided before tonight, because the numbers will be so outstanding for a particular candidate. But tomorrow the Diet goes back into session, and honestly, it's going to be 2 weeks before anything really gets done. The first 2 days, people are slapping each other on the back. Other people are crying in the bathroom, and then I think people know this, but when you win an election, frequently your supporters send you gifts and flowers and congratulatory remarks and flowers. And the flower of choice is the ran, the orchid. And gosh, I can't tell you how many orchids just litter the hallways. The flowers are just all over the place. And after about 4 or 5 days, things start to settle down. The LDP begins to publish a list of committee chairs and seats. The administrative vice ministers are probably already in place, but there could be some changes there. Those are bureaucrats that hold a seat under the minister, and then there's a political vice minister. So those appointments will be made. They'll be getting briefings as they're getting ready to get engaged. And then things will start happening in about 2 weeks, I would say, depending on the issues. I also think that Japan doesn't have a lot of time with figuring things out. There's too much that's going on the world market. The COP discussions are going on in Glasgow now on climate change and decarbonization, that sort of thing. Things are heating up with Taiwan and China. There's just so much going on. It was not a great time to have an election. And in fact, because of this election, it wasn't just this election for the lower house, the 465 members of the lower house, but it's also the election of the prime minister. We had that to go through, the decision by Suga not to run. So effectively, Japan has not really been in full gear. It hasn't been even in half gear for about 2 months. So politics has really retarded a vibrant policy movement on a lot of different issues. So there's a lot of catching up to do. And I think the people who get elected and receive committee posts or ministerial positions will be invigorated to move forward. But a lot of that depends on, how big the win is. So the issues that were discussed most prominently were nuclear. Nuclear was a big issue, and it became a big issue for an election in Hokkaido. And it was a big issue because Kono Taro was a proponent of, trying to distance, Japan from reliance on nuclear. He backed off a little bit because he wanted to become prime minister, but nuclear became a pretty big issue with the energy mix and decarbonization, that sort of thing. ASEAN was a big issue, what Japan's relationship is with trading partners throughout this region. The economy was probably the second biggest issue. And while the economy was an issue and while the election was going on, the Bank of Japan released certain figures showing the health of the economy, the rate of inflation. These weren't terribly good news, so it did become an issue. People were throwing mud at the LDP candidates. The LDP candidates were in a position to kind of defend themselves. So it was a pretty vibrant issue. The U.S.-Japan relationship plus the Taiwan component was a huge issue. Almost all candidates reflected on that. The wealth gap, the gap between the rich and the poor, and the number of people who are wealthy and enjoying things as a consequence of Abenomics, the long-term fiscal strategy of former Prime Minister Abe, and the current Prime Minister Kishida's philosophy or strategy for a renewed way of dealing with the economy. That was a very big issue. The wealth gap is rather prominent in this country, and it seems to be expanding. So he wants to address that. And once again, the opposition parties are criticizing him because it's the LDP and it's big business, and you guys are just concerned about money. COVID, of course, was a big issue and received a lot of attention, as you think it should. A lot of energy and interest in COVID vaccines for children, an oral vaccine being developed in Japan. And then finally, and this has been a teed up issue even when Suga was prime minister, they were discussing a new ministry or new agency. They came up with the agency for digitization. That took off. They came up with another agency for caring, to deal with mental health issues and the suicide in Japan, that sort of thing. And another idea that they came up with that didn't really get launched was Women and Children Agency. Let's deal with the distressed children and single mothers and that sort of thing. It didn't really take off to the degree that the digital agency did, but it still received a lot of verbal pronouncements. So in this election, this also received a lot of prominence because there are a lot of, obviously there are a lot of children that are suffering as a result of the economy and COVID, but also because of the education, because of, coming from a single household family, a single parent family, and that sort of thing. So it did receive a lot of playtime, especially it's one of the hot issues for Komeito. So Komeito and the LDP kind of share these ideas, even if the LDP doesn't feel so enthusiastic about it. In order to keep the Komeito happy, they know it's one of their pet issues, and so they will promote it. On the other hand, there are a couple of issues that didn't receive a lot of attention, and it's not because they're not important or not going to get a lot of attention, but it's because they're probably too contentious as far as the LDP is concerned, and the opposition hasn't really hammered these issues too hard on the LDP candidates. And those issues are defense. Defense didn't receive a whole lot of heat, although there are a lot of things going on with the Soviets and the Chinese flotilla passing through the straits through Hokkaido and then circumnavigating Japan and then exiting once again, which is pretty provocative, I would think. The constitutional revision didn't receive much playtime. The environment didn't receive a whole lot. It used to be really hot. It used to be so important with Koizumi as the environment minister. And then there were some pronouncements by Hagiura that we were going to back off a little bit from the decarbonization commitments. It received a little bit, but not a whole lot. It wasn't a defining issue. And then we didn't hear anything about Mr. Abe, about money in politics, about Sakuro Mirukai. We didn't hear much about that. Usually those are easy pieces of mud to pick up and fling, but you didn't hear much about that. And you also didn't hear much about Mr. Suga. You did hear a little bit about the masks. You remember those very fashionable masks that Mr. Abe promoted. You did hear a little bit about that, how much money was spent, how useless they were determined to be, the numbers that were produced and nobody's using them, so they're in storage, and the audit, Japan audit committee is reviewing that. But we didn't hear much about Mr. Abe or Suga there. So I think when the election is finished, these issues will receive a lot of attention, both the issues that did receive attention during the election campaign, because in some of them, certain commitments were made. For example, in nuclear or in ASEAN, in the economy. But the ones that weren't hot button issues, for example, defense, those are going to receive a lot of attention. You'll remember that 2 ministerial portfolios stayed the same when Mr. Kishida changed the cabinet. That was the Ministry of Defense and the Foreign Ministry. So we can anticipate that the defense profile of Japan will stay relatively the same, but I think it will actually ramp up. They didn't want to talk that much about it, and that's probably why. And the foreign policy of Japan will still be vibrant and continue as it is now. But I think defense will receive a lot more attention. One of the things that was discussed maybe last week or 2 weeks ago was the pronouncement, not yet a decision, to go from 1% of GDP to 2% of GDP for defensive capabilities, which include defensive capabilities that could be dual use. Dual use means they could be defensive, they could be offensive. A gun can shoot a bullet at somebody that's attacking you. It can also be used as a gun to attack somebody. So you've got that going. There's always the issue. It's usually Monday morning quarterbacking, when the people who didn't do so well lament the numbers and why they didn't just do so well. And I think we're going to have a little bit of soul searching tomorrow as well. A lot of it depends on how many people show up for the election. So here I am on the Chiba Peninsula, and it's drizzling rain. That's not a good sign. People, of the people who are going to vote, the largest portion are those that are undecided. So of all the people that are going to vote, 30% have already said they're going to vote for the LDP. And the LDP needs another 20%. That 20% is going to come from the undecided or those that are unaffiliated. And of all Japanese voters, the unaffiliated are about 40% of the entire mix. So those are the swing votes. And the swing votes are fickle. They might go, they might not go. They're not that compelled. And if it's raining, then they're less likely to go. If you are a Komeito supporter, Komeito has a very good integrated machine. It talks to its supporters, it keeps them engaged, and usually Komeito can pull out the vote. The LDP is a larger constituency, but it doesn't have as much of a grip as Komeito does. So even LDP voters might say, the election is not that contentious. I don't think my vote is going to make that much of a difference. The LDP, I'm okay with them the way they are now, and I think they'll probably stay at 50% with Komeito. They will think that in their mind and justify just staying at home and eating mikan and watching TV. So I don't know what the weather is like in Tokyo or in other places of Japan, but the weather has a huge a huge influence on the voters, and it's the undecideds who will really sway this one. So that's a pretty big deal. But the opposition is always has difficulty mustering votes for the most obvious reason that they did have power at one time, and it didn't go very well. You could say it was disastrous, but you would have to say it was disastrous in light of the fact that we had the triple disaster of the nuclear meltdown, the tsunami, and just the collapse of the economy as a consequence of that. So because of that very brief 36-month period, at first it was kind of fun because we got to see on TV Democratic Party, have committees roast the bureaucrats and members of the LDP on what they did and the policies they had and why the hell did you do it this way. It was fun. It was entertaining. It was like, yeah, go get them. But in terms of actually running the government, they did not do so well. And then, the earthquake and the nuclear disaster and the tsunami just kind of knocked them out. And I think probably people who are even sitting on the fence would say, even if they received something of a majority in coalition with another party, it would be difficult to envision, since they don't have the experience, they haven't had the opportunity, even in a cabinet portfolio, to exercise dominant political power. They probably are not going to be able to do very good, and we don't want to give them the time to have training wheels because there's so much going on. To make matters worse, because the Constitutional Democratic Party, it is the largest opposition party, the most likely scenario for it to gain power is in coalition with somebody else, and the most likely coalition partner is the Communist Party. So most people would say, are you kidding me? The Constitutional Democratic Party aligning with the Communist Party? Are you kidding me? They're so diametrically opposed. And the fact of the matter is that, yes, in certain situations, they have been cooperating with each other, not on central policy issues, but on election districts. So there was a by-election in Shizuoka last weekend. It was on our Sunday, the election was last week on our Sunday room. We didn't have the results, but we have the results now. And in Shizuoka, there was a member of the upper house who resigned, and so they had an election to fill that seat. That's an upper house seat, and the CDP went into coalition with the Communist Party, and they defeated the LDP. So this is a recipe that they've been experimenting with, of defining election districts that I'm going to take, and then I will support your candidate, or I won't oppose your candidate. I won't put one of my candidates in opposition to him, but you'd return the favor in another district. And that's what worked in Shizuoka. So they will combine forces on electoral basis, and you will see the results of that in the outcome of this election. And I think they will probably do pretty well. But I think in terms of sharing the government, and the Communist Party already said, even if we win and we have a coalition, we're not going to take a cabinet seat. We're not going to participate at that level. So it just doesn't telegraph much confidence or much power or much inspiration to the voters. So I think that scenario is very unlikely. Contrary to that, you've got Ishin, which is a political party based, initiated in Osaka, very popular in Osaka. It has a base in Tokyo as well, and they've fielded a lot of candidates in this race. They have 10 seats in the lower house, and it looks like they might increase maybe 100%. They could get another 10 seats in addition to the 10 that they have, and some projections are that they could get up to 30. I think probably not, but in any event, they're coming up very strong. One of the reasons why I was in Osaka was because many of the candidates who I am familiar with are either LDP or Ishin. So you might remember when I I think you know, I worked in the parliament as a diet secretary maybe 30 years ago. And the fellow that I worked for was from Osaka. He was a senator from Osaka. And he left the upper house to go to the lower house so that he could eventually become prime minister. I was involved in all of his elections, a lot of things that were going on with him. He didn't become prime minister, but he became foreign minister immediately after that election. They did so well at it. But one of the fellows who was a diet secretary in that office is now the leader of the Ishin branch in Tokyo. The Ishin party is focused in Osaka. I'm sorry, this is a little bit too detailed perhaps. But Ishin is on the run, and they are a party to watch. So when the elections come out, the election results come out, please keep an eye out for Ishin, because they will I think do very well. The Constitutional Democratic Party will pick up some seats. The LDP will lose some seats. Komeito will probably stay the same, might gain a seat or two. So I think those are the things that you should look at. The LDP is fielding, there are 465 seats. The LDP is, they have 336 candidates running for those seats. One of the things that frequently comes up is the people who are running and winning, they have legacy candidates. So there are two kind of big components. There are the members who have been in the LDP. There are members who have been 3 election cycles or less, and that's about 30% of all candidates. That's huge. 30% have only been in 3 elections, and those have all been under the Abe or Suga administrations. So they're going up now for a real fight without, being considered, one of Abe's acolytes. So it's a tough fight for them. On the other hand, is the old codgers, the guys who are older, they're going to retire. And the interesting thing about those fellows, those older guys, is that fully within the LDP, 30% of those are legacy candidates. That means that the fellow who is retiring, his son or his grandson or his wife is running for that party. So it's once again a flip of, it's just a legacy that is continued. It's not unique to Japan. It's just that in Japan it is fairly pronounced. In other countries it is somewhat more pronounced, in other Asian countries. But it is an issue that gives voters pause for concern. In this country, you can pass that goodwill, those networks and things, down to familial relations. You can do it to your children and your wife, sometimes your grandchildren. But once you get a little bit more distant from that, for example, your diet secretary or your best buddy, that stickiness begins to dissipate. So in this culture, in this society, it does create an option for people who want to stay in that position. And the LDP, of course, wants that, because you'll remember that there are 2 kinds of votes in Japan. There's the single seat vote, and then there's the proportional vote. And the proportional vote is dedicated to a political party. So if the political party can keep, Mr. Sato in office, and he's been in office for 30 years, and now he's going to retire, and it's going to be his son, it does promote that legacy, that stability, that consistency that appeals to a certain amount of voters. So this is endorsed by the LDP, and it doesn't contain here as many negatives as you might think. I'd like to begin to wrap up. I've been going on now for about half an hour. There are 2 other issues I want to talk about because they have political implications, but they're a little bit kind of off subject. One is Greg Kelly, who was the lawyer at Nissan. His trial was last week, and they will go into deliberations now, and a decision will come out in March, quite a bit away. And the reason why I mention this is because the decision of finding him guilty or not guilty, sentencing him to 2 years in jail, and maybe letting him free because 2 years have already been served. A very contentious issue. There are a lot of people who just hate Carlos Ghosn and what he did and what he represents. But there are a lot of people who feel like this was a conspiracy and it was a corporate inside job, and it also, involved the public prosecutor's office, and it was just a dirty deal, just the filthiest thing that people think about Japan. It was contained in that episode. So it's undecided yet how that will be decided, but the candidate for ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, he hasn't gone through Senate hearings. He hasn't been appointed as the ambassador yet, but since the Democrats hold the Senate, his appointment will probably be approved, and he will be in Japan at some period of time. He has said publicly, one of the things I'm going to focus on, ladies and gentlemen, is getting Greg Kelly out of jail. And I'm going to devote my energy to achieving that. So that sounds great, but for the people, the public prosecutor's office, the people in the public prosecutor's office, they hear that, and of course they just see somebody waving a flag at them. Who do you think you are? You once again a cowboy coming into town, hands on your hips and throwing your weight around. It's just typical of you guys coming in and trying to tell us how to do things. It could raise that specter. But I think probably the most likely scenario is the Japanese public prosecutor's office will be compelled for political reasons and for public policy concerns to find some level of guilt for Greg Kelly and let him go for time already served. That's yet to be seen, and it's just an issue to keep your eye on because it does have a dynamic within the U.S.-Japan relationship. The second thing I want to talk about is the marriage of Kei Komuro and Princess Mako, which was completed this last week. So there was such a frenzy, YouTube and social media frenzy on that. They finally tied the knot, and the press has died down, thankfully. So maybe these two can begin to live their life and move forward. I think this is not the last that we're going to hear about this issue. Number one, they plan to live in the United States. He's taken the bar. The results of the bar exam have not been released yet. And he wants to pursue a legal career in the United States. So what you can expect from that is that moving forward into the future, he will be relied upon as a commentator for what's going on in Japan, what's going on with the imperial household and succession and that sort of thing. So he will be viewed and portrayed as an expert in that sort of thing. And I think his comments will contain a little bit of a tinge, a negative tinge with regard to the imperial household, as one would expect. The other thing is that he's going to go to the United States. He obviously has a visa. He had a student visa to do that, and the law firm that he's joined will work for him to have a work visa. But in order to bring his wife to the United States permanently, that's a process that sometimes takes 6 months. It is a very difficult process to go through, even if the southern borders, you can walk across the border and get into the United States. When you actually follow the process and try and become even not an immigrant, but married to a person who has a proper working visa, they actually do quite a bit of due diligence. And it is not a secured issue that she will get a visa in order to join her husband. So if the imperial household is that angry and makes its disdain known to the United States Embassy and the granting of a visa application, it could delay things. It could make things difficult for this couple. So just keep your eye on that. It's kind of too bad. I mean, people have different opinions about that, but they're married now, and I think it would be nice just to leave them alone. But the point that I'm trying to make is that you haven't seen the last of it. You haven't heard the end of it. This will go on. He's a young man. He's going to move on his career. He's going to do interesting and valuable things. And I think it's going to remain to be a thorn in the side of the imperial household. I'd like to close up my comments there, open the floor, and talk about issues that maybe I glossed over or I didn't do a good enough job on. But Maya, let's open it up.
A question to you. So get ready, it's a long question again.
Always get the shivers whenever you ask these questions, Maya.
I know, sorry. So you mentioned that, well, two of the issues which are going to be big issues after the election is over, they weren't discussed before the election. So these are the defense budget and the constitutional revision. So, and both of them are going to be big issues. And it's interesting that, well, in a sense, they're connected. And the LDP had a 9-year window to revise the constitution, and they missed that chance. So, and it looks like they're not going to get the necessary majority to, to be able to revise the constitution after this election, which means that they'll have to settle for the defense budget only. So, and I wonder, of course, I'm not so deeply involved in politics, so my knowledge is not detailed enough. But is there any chance for them, that for the LDP or for the party in coalition with Komeito to actually get enough votes and realize the constitutional revision after the election?
So, in the period of time after the end of the war and the enactment of the current constitution, this constitution, the Constitution of Japan, has not been revised. It has not been touched in one area. Not a letter has been changed. And that's rather unusual and strange in a modern democracy. So many people are dedicated to changing that pattern, and they feel like the Constitution should be changed. Like, it is a peace constitution, so there are some people that are tightly affiliated with that philosophy. We were involved in war. We kind of let it get out of hand, and as a consequence of that, we suffered from 2 nuclear explosions. Never again will we allow the government to put us into that position. So there's a large, probably a majority of the Japanese people who feel that way. And on the other hand, you have the LDP, which is determined to not only change the constitution, but to increase defense spending and to make Japan an admirable country that can project its power throughout the region. And when you hear that said, especially for some Southeast Asian nations, it just sends shivers up you, and you have visions of the rising star flag, on battleships that are sailing into port. So there is that legacy. But I think the only thing that's missing, I think ultimately the Constitution will be revised. We don't need to revise the Constitution to go from 1% to 2% of GDP, because that restriction is self-imposed. It has nothing, it's not written in the Constitution. What's written in the Constitution is Japan will only devote its defense forces for defensive purposes, not offensive purposes. So when you interpret that means that you have your islands with defensive protections, but you don't have an expeditionary force. You don't have like the Marines that are capable of, beach landings and amphibious machinery and that sort of thing. You might have missiles that can destroy missiles, but they're not missiles that can be launched to attack other things. So it's really complex. It's really tightly defined. But I think what you're missing here is an activant. So I think what Mr. Abe missed was a real incident with North Korea during his tenure. And maybe if the launch of the missiles and then the arrival of, ballistic submarines had happened a little bit earlier, maybe the fear of the Japanese population would have been such that he would have been able to push that through. He came very close. So I think even under a Kishida administration, with a couple of incidents that come up where Japanese citizens are killed or that damage to the national archipelago is incurred because of some sort of an attack, you'll see a flip. And the unfortunate part of that is that you can never go back. You can be pacifist and against aggression, or once you cross that bridge and you go back, it is awful hard to turn that back. So that's why it's such a battlefield. That most people want the peace constitution, and they believe that if they're pacifist and don't present much of a threat, then China will just ignore them. And I think under the current scenario, with what's going on in Taiwan, the very provocative flotilla of Russian and Chinese ships circumnavigating Japan, I think, a decision needs to be made sometime soon. We're just waiting for an act event. Sorry for such a long-winded answer.
No, thank you for the detailed answer. But what you said, I have talked with a lot of people here, local people, and it's anecdotal still, but what I have heard from them actually supports what you said about the population being against the revision in the constitution. So, and not wanting to allow the government to drag the country into another war.
It's true. I mean, it's one of the most beautiful things about Japan and about the constitution, about the culture and the philosophy here, is that we have a peace constitution, and it is remarkable in the world to have a constitution like that after having gone through a war and the destruction to come out like that. But it is also accurate to say that the constitution was not conceived and completely written by the Japanese hand. So you've got that too.
I have one more question to you. So you mentioned, you talked about the electoral system, and so how the seats are actually single seat vote and proportional votes. And just this morning, I read an article in, was it Japan Today, where Michael Chuchek, who was here a couple of times in this room, he was cited saying that the electoral system in Japan is actually tilted in favor of the LDP. Is this because of these seats, the single vote, that's the single seat votes and also the proportional votes, or could you please give me a little bit more details about it?
Sure. There are a couple of things going on here, and Michael Chuchek, he's not in our room today, so too bad.
Yeah, too
for
bad.
him. But there are a couple of things going on. One of them is the distribution of voters compared to seats in the parliament. And there has long been a state of unconstitutionality. Those words are in quotes because those were the words that were emanated from the Supreme Court when it went to an issue. And the issue is it's one man, one vote. And I have my vote has as much weight as anybody else's vote. There are several districts where the population is declining, but they still have the number of members in the upper house or in the lower house to represent them. So that's one issue. They've had to change that and reduce the number in certain areas and increase the numbers in other areas, like in Tokyo. Tokyo and Osaka. So the numbers in Japan, this is such an interesting and incredible country. But 40% of the population lives in either Tokyo or Osaka. I'm sorry, 60% live in either Tokyo or Osaka. And the remaining 40% live in the rest of the country. So there is a huge demographic attraction for bringing people into the major metropolitan centers and depopulating the rural areas. So one of the issues that Michael was talking about, the proportional representation favoring the LDP, one of those issues is the redistricting of seats. And the other issue is that in the past, the LDP benefited from rural votes. What is the Agricultural Association?
Oh, that's JA, Japan Agriculture, maybe?
Nokyo.
Nokyo.
So Nokyo is very popular. It's throughout the country. It's well organized, and it is kind of a vehicle for promoting LDP policies. So the LDP has been very strong in the rural districts, but because of the proportional system, it was created just a couple of years ago to address the imbalance, but it was created while the LDP was in power. So of course the LDP has these ways of figuring things out so that it looks like it's even and everybody has a reasonable chance and it's all fair. In fact, in application, we have found that there is a slant towards the LDP, and we learned that. Many people suspected it before it went into play, but once the elections were run, it did certify that, yes, indeed, the LDP has a ingrown advantage through that proportional representation. Because when you vote for the proportional representation, you vote for a party. And the biggest party, and in Japan, big means better. Big means, secure and reliable. So there's a tendency for people to, when they're undecided, to say, well, I guess they're the ones that are going to do the better job because they're the biggest.
Thank you for that. Okay. And then one more question. Well,
gosh, you're chatty today.
How about that? We know that the LDP is actually a party of a lot of factions, and well, we don't know actually how many of the factions will get votes this time and how many votes they will have. Obviously, every faction has a different, let's say, reach throughout the voting districts. So do you expect that the party, of course, it's difficult to predict it, but I'm asking for your expectation. Do you expect that the LDP will suffer from further factional divide, or probably the party will be better off after the elections?
The LDP, you can't understand the LDP without understanding the factions within the LDP. So there are about 6, maybe 7 factions within the LDP. There's the largest, then the second largest, that is second largest only by maybe 15 members. And then the third largest, which is almost neck and neck with the second. And then the next one, which is neck and neck as well. And then you've got the smaller ones. So it's not quite an inverted pyramid with the most powerful at the bottom with lots of votes, and then the second one coming in with substantially fewer. But the fight is always between the factions to have more members. And it's already pretty much decided. There are people who are running as independents. I'm not affiliated with those guys because I'm a different guy, I'm for you and children and small dogs, and I'm that kind of candidate. Even though maybe I was a bureaucrat in the ministry, and I have LDP leaning policy pronouncements, but I'm independent. So there are a lot of people like that. And once the election is over and they get elected, then they join the LDP. They finish their independence and they claim a party to join. And once they do that, they can remain as independents within the LDP or join a faction. And already there have been several candidates quietly who have said, once the election is over, boss, I'm going to join your faction. So people are like rubbing their hands like Evel Knievel, evil, what is it, in some of the cartoons, for waiting for this day to come, because even the addition of just one single member has a huge impact on the factions. And that impact is represented in cabinet seats that come out. So you could see in Kishida's selection of his cabinet, he could have done one of two things. He could have selected cabinet members because I'm coming up for election and I want the cabinet to be full of people who are popular and who the voters will see and say, oh, I know them and they're really cool.
Right.
The other selection set that he had was, I need to repay the people who made me prime minister. Even though they might not be well known, they come from the factions that helped me get elected. And he chose the second. So maybe he's going to rethink that after the numbers come in tonight. And maybe he's going to say, I should have put, Konotaro, I should have given him a cabinet portfolio. I should have done something else with maybe one or two of the other people. Maybe I should have had 2 or 3 more women, that sort of thing.
Right.
But after the election, you will see a couple of defections from one political faction to another. Like I was in the Abe faction, but it looks like Mr. Aso is doing really well now. He's going to be continuing on through the vehicle of his brother-in-law as finance minister, and that's a pretty powerful position. So there's this constant fight within the LDP. It's a political party it's like it's got a drinking problem. It's a political party with an infighting problem.
I see. That's interesting. And yeah, I never thought of, about such, let's say, changes of the number of the factions, because members of one faction join other factions too.
You also, because of the layout of the LDP, so the center of gravity in Japanese politics at one time, we've discussed this before, used to be in the ministries. And that was when Japan was economically strong and Japan is number one. And the ministries were basically controlling and driving the economy. And then it began to shift a little bit over towards the prime minister's office. They just completed construction of a brand new, fabulous prime minister's office. Mm-hmm. And the center of power began to shift there and was pretty secure for several elections. And now we can see that the power has shifted yet again to the LDP. So the real power base is shared between the LDP and the Prime Minister's office. The LDP is, directing policy and defining, election districts and that sort of thing. But it is a very powerful part of it. On the administrative side, in the Prime Minister's office, they have an office of 600-700 people that are dealing with these issues. So it's a very powerful machine. Mr. Amari, who is the Secretary General, now it's like a magnet. He will attract people because they want to continue being a politician. They want to get a committee seat or a chair, or they just want to make sure that they can stay in the diet. So cozying up to those people who look like they have good legs and a longevity, mm-hmm. you will see that. And that is precisely why during this election period, Mr. Amari has been attacked on several fronts. So the people that don't like that, they don't want him to get that stranglehold, to be able to extract that kind of enthusiasm from undecided or maybe people who are already affiliated with a political faction to change their allegiances. That happens a lot. That happens a lot in Japan. It happens a lot in politics. They say in Washington, D.C., in this town, if you want a friend, get a dog, because there are no friends. There's only political expediency. And I think the same is true here.
Yeah, sounds like a universal rule. So I have a question through the back channel. CDP is a bit of a mystery for me and maybe Japanese people as well. So because I cannot see the difference between CDP and LDP. So what's the difference between their ideas and strategies?
Isn't that really a failure in messaging? Right?
Yes.
It really is. So if people don't
really
know that
terrible
distinction.
Yes, those
parties. And
communicating.
Yes, the leader Edano has been very vocal about what he supports and what he what his team theme is. But I think people who are watching or people who are just kind of listening with half an ear, the only thing they hear is criticism of the LDP. attacking, those positions of authority within the LDP, the decisions they made, the money in politics, and that sort of thing. We, the Constitutional Democratic Party, are much, more firm. We're more firm on the defense policy. We want, the reconsideration of, the defense posture and how big business is controlling and driving the economy, and easy money, the economy, and the disparity between those who have money, those guys that belong to the LDP, of course, and those who don't, people who are in my party, for example. So the LDP is very clever and very astute in looking at other political parties, what their message is, and absorbing them as their own. And so that's why I think you saw Mr. Kishida say, we need to recreate the economy and we need to distribute the wealth more evenly. He got into trouble for that because the Bank of Japan and the Ministry of Finance said, whoa, partner, first earn money and then redistribute it. Don't redistribute it and then think about earning it. So he had to backtrack a little bit. But that's because he's the LDP and he's in the position of power. The party that is not in power can say that easily, and it sounds nice. It sounds like these guys are thieves and they're just in it for themselves, and it's just the big fat cats. So that's, I think, the Constitutional Democratic Party. You can take a look on their webpage and see their manifesto, the positions that they hold on defense, on economy, on social welfare, that sort of thing. I think they've taken a leaf from Kometo's position because they're similar in some regards to Kometo, and pretty much opposed to the LDP on defense and economic policy. So, but even the question tells you, they're what in the hell. At least there's a guy that's running for office, and you know what he stands for. NHK Bukats,
Well,
kill
clear
NHK.
Message. Yes, yeah.
That's a message that resonates. He will do well. It's a very simple message. He might have other positions on, the economy or on women or on LGBT or things like that, but he does have an issue that resonates with people. Why the hell do we have to continue to pay for NHK? I never watch it. I have a TV. That doesn't mean that you get to tax me and stop knocking on my door, right?
Yes. It looks like, the Constitutional Democratic Party, they haven't been able to communicate their message well, but one of the reasons is that they don't really have a clearly set policy, right? Their strategies are always more like, let's say, opposition to whatever LDP says.
Right. Attack.
Right?
Exactly. Attack from behind.
So that's a reaction. So it's very reactional. It's not really something which they have set, to follow in the short, middle, or long term. It's really just a reaction to what the LDP says. And maybe that's why they have failed to communicate their message clearly.
Well,
but this is just an opinion, and I may be mistaken, of course. We don't know. But
no, I think in Japanese society and culture, to be the one that's throwing the stones is not, it's not an attractive stance. But to stand up for, what you believe is right and what's going to make a difference is perceived as a very honorable thing to do. But I think they're stuck because they're so obviously out of power that their best strategy is, coming up with criticisms of what these guys are doing wrong. I think if you were leading that party, you have several options to appeal to the voters. And anytime you say anything good about, the economy or COVID response or defense, they're going to take that and meld it into something a little bit different, make it their own, and it just diminishes the power that you once had in it. So that means that you're forced to take diametrically opposed positions on important issues. And that means that your opposition, the LDP in this case, needs to be really wrong. So you look for scandals. So I I think one of the other reasons Mr. Kishida selected the cabinet portfolios that he did was to make sure people, I don't want any scandals. I don't want anybody caught, going to Ginza and, getting drunk or, having a picture taken coming out of the hotel. Please, none of that. So the scandals really, Michael Chuchek and I, in fact, on Tokyo on Fire, we did a episode on scandals in Japan and how powerful they are and how they are used to bend and to change perceptions, because the voting public here is very intolerant of scandals, and that's why Bunshin is so popular, and why even somebody gets, a toenail out of joint, they really suffer a lot for that.
I've got other questions. The next series of questions comes from Ted, and the first one is, so
Hi,
it's a
Ted.
bit long. Thank you, Ted, for the questions. I've seen and read reports that Japanese workers say that no matter how hard they work, their raises are not rising. So probably this is the salaries. Prime Minister Kishida says that he will try to fix this problem by offering a new type of capitalism, a departure from Abenomics, that will raise wages of workers and close the expanding wealth gap. Can you share with us what steps he plans to take to address this? Also, every now and then, I read reports about poverty increasing in Japanese society, particularly among women who lost their jobs during the pandemic. Can you give us a sense as to the scope of this problem, or is it exaggerated? So this is the first question.
So the first one is about the frustration of regular Japanese workers with the stagnation of wages. And it is absolutely true that during the period of the Abe administration, under his economic policies, the Japanese corporations made lots of money. They made a windfall of money. And what they did with that, so this was under a trickle-down theory, that if the companies start generating more income and their stock prices go up, they will trickle this down. They will pay more for their employees. They will expand operations, that sort of thing. And it never works. It didn't work in the United States. It doesn't work here. The rich just keep getting richer. And Mr. Kishida has expressed his ire at the Japanese corporations who are hoarding the money. So they do have lots of money stored up. They nest egg it for a rainy day. And the other kind of problem with this is that inflation hasn't really increased that much, but also the economy has not done very well. So in the roaring 80s and 90s, the Japanese economy was on fire, and if people devoted themselves to their work and they showed up on time and their suit was pressed and they really dedicated themselves, they could see, their family could see that they were rising in salary, they were rising in position, that sort of thing. Since the, certainly the 2000s, but a little bit earlier than that too, the economy was beginning to tank. And even, I think for young people, even if you worked hard and you went to work and you didn't see what your father experienced, you don't see that there's a path forward, that people are making money, and that you benefit from that. So you had a lot of people that were disenfranchised or disenthused to actually dedicate themselves to that. So then you had this thing with the fritas, people who didn't want to become a seishain, that didn't want to join the workforce. They preferred to do online work, frita, doing a couple of jobs and maintaining their independence, because everything that their parents stood for, they turned out to despise. So there is a certain segment of the younger population who's probably in their 30s now who fit that category. So what Kishida said is, I want you companies to begin to divulge some of that wealth. So what he's going to do that is to tax them. He's going to give benefits to those who begin to pay their a higher salary to their employees, and I think you'll begin to see that because they don't want the government to be that engaged. So you will see a little bit of increase in that. I think he'll make some inroads. Some of the larger companies, some of the larger companies that contribute to the LDP will pretend to embrace that, and to the degree that they can get away with it, they'll pay as little as possible. But I think you'll see that. So yeah, that's how he is going to achieve that. He's got a carrot and he's got a stick. And I think it's obvious that the Japanese workers, for a long time, their salaries have been stagnant, prices have been increasing only gradually, but not in tune with the salaries. The second part of the question, so there are a couple of aspects here, and it's not just single family homes, and it's not just women who have lost their jobs due to the pandemic. It is also those people who are just they've decided to check out. So there's even though it's said that Japan is dominated by the big companies, big companies and seishain and people who work in companies exceeding 500 employees, that's a very small portion of the Japanese economy, actually. The majority are people who work in small companies, family-run companies, and the COVID has particularly hit them, especially restaurants and the service industry. So there are a lot of people who have hit below the poverty level, and they're living on their savings, and they can't wait for the economy to pick up again, and for tourism to start, and for restaurants. So that's why you see this huge push. I think tomorrow people can begin to gather without restrictions. There was, under the state of emergency, several restrictions for keeping social distance and the number of people in big events. And tomorrow. So one of the things that you will definitely see in response to Ted's question is the relaxation and quickly the relaxation of the tight immigration for allowing people to travel into Japan, and for people from Japan to travel outside. And that is a huge boost to the economy. But it is true, the number of orphans in Japan is very large, and the number of kids who are dependent on school lunches because the family is not being able to provide as much there. So it is a huge issue. It gets a bit of attention, and I think the LDP has suggested an agency to deal with that. I'm not sure how much enthusiasm there is within the LDP for it, so we'll see. But I think the Komeito is in particularly pushing it, because the Komeito is the party for the social structure of and the downtrodden and the people who are really suffering. The Komeito is really adamant about that, and as a consequence, the LDP has to soften its stance a little bit. So I think you'll see some good progress there once the election numbers are in. You had some other points,
Yes,
and I hope
there are
that
other
responds somewhat.
points. Yes, thank you for that. Ted, I just did a quick search and I couldn't find any recent statistics about this. I'm sorry. The second question of Ted was, I read an Associated Press article this week that Japan will likely not open its doors to fully vaccinated travelers until the spring. And what have you heard? So you partially answered this question, but I think that we need to make a clear distinction between business travelers and leisure travelers here, because the government is obviously aware of this distinction. And I think that, well, basically the industry, the corporate, that's the Keidanren, is really adamant, and pushing very hard for opening the borders to business travelers first. And then leisure travel, inbound travel to Japan will probably, have to wait a little bit more. before they open the borders fully, even to, fully vaccinated travelers. I don't know, Timothy, do you have any insights on this?
So this is potentially a very hot diplomatic issue. Many of the chambers of commerce in Japan have uh, banded together to lobby the Prime Minister's office on relinquishing the restrictions on business travelers in particular, just as you said. And that is the first brick that will come out, because in reality, the foreign capital companies are far more disadvantaged by this policy than by the local companies. There are many local companies that have huge global interests, and it does hurt them too. But the foreign capital companies who have come and set up business here, they've established, business operations, they've maybe purchased buildings and manufacturing, they suffer disproportionately more. And so the desire of these countries to make that clear to the Japanese Prime Minister has been a very hot button issue. I think the Prime Minister has said, as a consequence of that, not directly as a consequence of that, but what the Japanese policy going forward with regard to COVID is going to be is we are going to coexist with it. Many countries have reached this conclusion too, but this is a kind of a new step for Japan. We are not going to do zero sum, just make sure that we don't have any COVID. And that's why we have to wear our masks and be social distance and have the borders closed. They've decided instead that they're going to coexist with it. They're going to bolster hospitals and devices for the sick people and really ramp up research and development for an oral vaccine and to develop, hopefully a homegrown vaccine so they don't have to rely on, for example, Pfizer or Moderna to purchase those, because that's an outflow of money. The Japanese have traditionally been reluctant to pay for things that go out, money outflow. They prefer to get money that comes in as a philosophical statement of their economic outlook. So I think you will see, pretty quickly a relaxation for business travelers. I think you'll see that probably before February.
Right, thank you for that. And there is one more question from Ted. And then after that, we've got two more questions from other people in the audience. So the third question from Ted is, are you an Atlanta Braves fan?
So I went to Atlanta after my family moved from Okinawa. I was 16 years old. I went to Atlanta. I went to high school there. I went to college there. And then I left Atlanta on my path to come back to Japan. So I am a Braves fan because the Braves were the city baseball team. They were the famous Atlanta Braves, and they won the semifinals to go to the World Series. And so I get lots of posts from my friends on Facebook and through telephone about the Braves, and my friends who are in Atlanta. If you've never been to the United States, it is a culture that is dominated by sports and football and these team dynamics within cities. So yes, Atlanta is really hot with the Atlanta Braves. I can't say that I'm a fan. I couldn't name a player that's on that team. When I came to Japan, following sports was just out of the question. It was just an invitation for more frustration, so I stopped following sports. Sorry about that, Ted.
The next question is from, we've got Hiroko. And then her question is, since Hashimoto and Isshin no Kai has been strong in Osaka, now for this election, Osaka is a swing prefecture. What are the reasons for this? Even though Isshin no Kai is strong, still Osaka is a swing prefecture. How come?
Who asked the question?
Hiroko.
Okay, so Hidoko, I wish she had asked it so that we can have a little bit of back and forth.
Yeah.
But I think the underlying response there is because Osaka hates Tokyo, of course, you know. So there's this long-standing feud between Tokyo and Osaka, and the guys in Osaka think these guys from Tokyo, they're so stuck up and their fingernails are manicured and they walk funny, and we guys from Osaka, we got great food and we can we can do all sorts of things at the same time that we're doing something else. And if the light is red and there's no traffic, we can cross the street, right? And it's just a huge cultural gap between these two cities, and they're constantly competing with each other. So the appeal of Ishin no Kai to people from Osaka is exactly that. We are not dominated by what these guys in Tokyo are pretending to dictate to us. We have our own culture, our own society. We also are the manufacturing base of Japan, and our food is much better than what those guys eat in Tokyo. So I think that's part of it. That there's this a bit of a rebel aspect to it. And Hashimoto is, he was the party leader. He's backed off quite a bit from there, and he's turned the reins over to the current leader, and they seem to be doing really well. But I think one of the reasons why they do really well is because they're not Tokyo, and I think that's kind of just a finger in the eye. But their policies and their proposals are, really directed to, a focus on, Eastern Japan, that part of Japan that, is really the manufacturing base. Kyoto is there, and it's not the nation's capital. I think that's part of it. I don't know if that completely responds, but it's an interesting dynamic whenever you talk about Tokyo and Osaka. And when I went there last week, yeah, you can texturally feel how different the economies are, the population, the people who are on the streets, the vibrancy. It's pretty much something that you can experience yourself just by visiting.
Right. Thank you. I have one more question. Then we've got Nej here. And
Mm-hmm.
his question is, how does the proportional representation electoral system make Japanese elections different, or does it make any real difference at all?
Yeah, I think it does make a difference because when they do an assessment of how people feel, they look at the proportional representation list and how people are considering that. Because when you vote on the proportional you're voting for a political party, and the political party obviously consists of individuals, but it's more how the party projects itself and what it stands for. And you can see that through the pronouncements of the various party leaders on television. They had all of them lined up, and they have the same question asked to them, and what do you think about that? And how they look and how they project themselves. And a lot of it is just determined by atmospherics and touchy-feely kind of things. So the political party, by being polished and representing the issues very clearly and succinctly, is defined in the proportional representation. So you can see how the population feels philosophically by the proportional representation process. It only is about 2/5 of the entire voting system, but it is a strong component. Unfortunately, the people who are selected under the proportional representation system are considered to be less viable and less powerful, less respectful than those people who win seats based on their own name. Please vote for me because I'm me. This is what I stand for. This is my pedigree, and my father did this, so I'm here for you. Those people who get those votes are held in higher esteem than those who are run from the proportional. And that gap of emphasis, that is accrued by the political party. So nothing is lost and nothing is gained. It's either the individual or the political party. I hope that responds somewhat to the question. It's a good question.
Cannot help but wonder whether this proportional electoral system helps or prevents the infusion of new blood into the political system as a whole.
I thought you were going to ask a different question, but that's a good question. I thought you were going to ask. I wonder if this setup for proportional representation freezes out other competing political parties from being established.
Okay, that's
And I think
probably the
it
better
does that.
question. Okay, yes.
I think it does that. But forming a political party, Yamamoto Taro formed his political party. It was very touch and go. You need a certain number of people beyond one to make a political party, because one doesn't make a political party. So getting people to be in a coalition with you to the degree that they're going to sign their name and launch a party, that's a big deal in this country. It happens very infrequently, and it's kind of not a very good gamble. But the question that was asked is, doesn't it prevent new blood from being inserted? And I think, yeah, so if you want to be on the proportional list, you go to the political party and you say, hi, I'm a member, or maybe I want to be a candidate, and I would like to be on the list. Their list might be 60 people deep. You're going to be number 60 or number 59, unless you have something that compels them to say, because of your prominence, because of the book that you wrote, because of the movie that you appeared in, we're going to put you at 15 or 16. And if the numbers come in and they get number 1 off the list, number 2 off the list, number 3 off the list, number 4, number 5, he was on both lists and he won his district based on his name, so he's off. So number 7 shoots up, getting down to that party based on their prominence or whatever it is that they did. They rescued somebody from a burning house or something like that. It's hard to bring those people up. It's a little bit easier in the upper house, but in the lower house, it's a lot more rough and tumble. But I think the short answer is, yeah, I think it probably does prevent newer blood from coming in. The way new blood comes in is either because dad is retiring or died, or because you had an issue, you were involved in some sort of tragedy, you become the representation of that, and you promote that issue, and you look good on TV, your teeth are straight, and people like you. The other way that new blood comes in, and it's not quite new blood, it's by diet secretaries running for the office in the same election district. Maybe their boss has moved on. And then the third more popular one is somebody that's in one of the ministries has been encouraged by a political party, more likely than not the LDP. We've been watching you for a couple of years. You're a good guy. You do what we ask you to do. You've helped us out in a couple of problem issues, and we'd like to support you as a candidate. What do you think? Do you want to run? And if you run, we'll support. We'll give you money for the campaign and show you how you're supposed to talk to people on TV and in big audiences. So what do you say? And that's the third more popular way to become a politician. But I don't think the vast majority of those are not qualified as new blood.
Right.
New blood is quite rare to get into Japanese politics.
Yeah, that's interesting. It shows why we don't see that much change in strategies and policies in public affairs as well. It's interesting, really.
Yeah, but even if you do get new blood in, it's hard to insert yourself in the conversation without really making people mad. The people that are in the bigger parties or in the bigger factions. So, like Koizumi or like Konotaro,
Yes.
if you go a little bit off script, all of a sudden you're the bad guy, and it's not just you're kind of bad, but you're like really bad. you're in the same political party as me, but you're the bad guy. So it is a tough game.
We have exhausted all the questions.
Thank you. We opened the room with the same kind of message to the audience, and that is that I'm really proud of being able to have this room 38 weeks consecutively. The audience is a great audience, real dedicated Japan hands, people who know what we're talking about. We don't need to go into great detail to talk about a lot of the issues. There's a level of understanding with people, and I'd like to continue that. My only appeal is that I, especially during this campaign period, I've been involved in a lot of discussions and webinars and briefings and that sort of thing, and also participating in those of competitors or other analysts like Michael Chuchek and a lot of other people. My delivery to this team here on Clubhouse is probably, in fact, I know it because it's by design. It's not so deep, the figures. It's not too detailed and analytical. What I'm trying to do is present a picture of what's going on that's important to who I think my audience is. And the audience that I believe is here are people who are involved in trade, in diplomacy, in Japanese politics, for what it means to the nation as a whole and how Japan presents itself to the outside world. So those are issues that are important to all of us. And there might be other issues that we're really keen to delve into, like, defense. What's going to happen with the Aegis, and are these missiles, the defense missiles and our drones going to be a part of the mix? And when we go from 1% to 2% of the Japanese defense budget, are these components going to be contained in it? Those kind of deeper dives, I just leave that open for discussion. So the whole point here is engage the audience, engage you, and give you the information that is interesting and makes sense and explains some of the things that are curious to just the normal observer. Not everybody has the time or the inclination to get as deep into it as people like me, but maybe the insight that I have helps you understand what those connections are, and that's the drive here. So if I'm not hitting that mark, please, tell Maya. She'll tattle on you, and she'll tell me to, beef up the game so that the audience gets more information or better information of the kind that you want. So I'm just kicking that out there. Thanks, Maya. Great. Thanks, Maya.
Thank you. This was Japan Expert Insights Room on Japanese politics. Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air next Sunday at 8:30 in the morning, Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the conversations on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Again, we're looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and enjoy every day as much as possible. See you!